occasion, I may ask a follow-up question. And as you will see, tonight we're following a traditional debate technique of indicating how much time the speaker has left by a set of lights. There's a set on either side of the stage here, and one on each candidate's podium. When the yellow light comes on, he has 30 seconds left. When the red light comes on, his time is up, and he will cease and desist. Stations KDKA in Pittsburgh and KYW in Philadelphia have solicited questions from the viewers in Pennsylvania, and I'll be drawing on those in the course of the debate. Now I'd like to begin with a question to all three of you. You'll have an opportunity to respond and to rebut each other's responses. You are aware of what the time limits are and of the lights on your podium. There is a central issue in this campaign, it seems to me, of where the Democratic Party ought to be going from here. It's an issue that I think still needs some clarifying. I'm not talking about the party's past, and I'm not talking about any candidate's past. What I am asking is, what do you think the direction of the Democratic Party, the new direction of the Democratic Party, ought to be from here, and how do you differ on this from your opponents? According to a drawing, Mr. Mondale goes first. Mr. Mondale.
I see three central, essential objectives in dealing with our nation's future. The first is to lead the world toward a safer world. This means policies that will get those god-awful nuclear weapons under control. I favor a freeze. I favor a broad range of initiatives that will move us toward arms control. It means electing a president who knows both the dangers and the complexities of the world, who understands that American foreign policy must be undergirded by our values and by understanding and respect so that we have the leadership necessary in the world. Secondly, I think it is clear that America must have sound, effective, tough, new economic policies that restore the competitive edge of our economy so that the jobs, the future, and the prosperity are here and not elsewhere. And finally, we must have a president who insists on restoring that fundamental sense of fairness that's so basic to American values. That means the enforcement of laws against discrimination, the protection of our senior citizens, fairness across the board, across the whole range of American life, and a president who understands that he's been elected by the people to serve the people.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson?
The great challenge of our party and our nation today is to alter the misery index. Under Mr. Reagan, there are now 8 million more people in poverty, 3 million more children. Now 15% of our nation, the richest nation in the history of the world, is in poverty, 34 million people. At the present rate, 41 million by the end of this year. There's been a cutback in Head Start programs for impoverished children, a cutback in breakfast programs, a cutback in lunch programs, a cutback in food stamp programs, a cutback in job development and job training. One mission of our party is to protect our children in the dawn of life. It's so much cheaper to feed the child than to jail the man or to jail the woman. So much cheaper to feed that child and educate that child and incarcerate that child or that adult in jail. We have some obligation to begin to build houses again. A tremendous crisis in public housing, economic revitalization affecting the misery index. On the other hand, under this administration, the danger index is on the rise. We've now lost the lives of our young men in Honduras, in Grenada, in Lebanon. Surely we must go another way. Our party, therefore, must have an obligation to fight for a peace policy and not a war policy. We can, in fact, go another way. If we affect the misery index, the poor will support us. If we infect the danger index, those who feel threatened by war will support us. Beyond that, there's a new Democratic constituency. A nation 53% female, 50% of our nation's, 50% of our party is female, 70% of all poor children live in a house headed by a woman. The women, the blacks, the Hispanics, the Latino, the poor, that's the wave of our future.
Mr. Hart.
I believe each of us here are here on purpose. And that is because each of the three of us fundamentally share the basic ideals and goals of the Democratic Party. Otherwise, we would not have ended up as the finalists for our party's nomination in this critical year. It has been suggested that perhaps there are degrees of commitment to civil rights and to the fundamental rights of human citizens in this country and abroad. I don't see that difference. I think Fritz Mondale, Jesse Jackson, and I are all equally committed to those fundamental values and goals of equality, of social justice, of opportunity for all of our citizens. This is a critical period of change in this country. I'm a Democrat not only because of those fundamental ideals and principles, but because to achieve them, our party has always been willing to change in periods that required change. The theme of my campaign of new leadership is one that addresses a new generation of problems. The sweeping revolutions that have brought this country into the international marketplace in the 70s, that have transformed our own economy from one principally based on manufacturing to one increasingly diverse, requires new ideas and new proposals. That's what Franklin Roosevelt did. That's what President Kennedy did. That's what our other great democratic leaders have done. That's why I put so much emphasis on addressing the new problems of the 1980s and not going back to the old policies of the past that are not working. We've lost the confidence of the majority of the voters in this country. To regain it, we must convince them that we are prepared to govern this country. To do that, we must put forward proposals that do in fact address the real needs of this nation and the world.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Now, I'm only going to use rebuttal time because we have plenty of other things to do tonight. If any of you want to use it to spell out what you see as the differences among you as to where the party ought to go from here.
I would like to use just a moment if I can.
All right, Mr. I'm doing the calling on tonight. Mr. Mondale.
One point of major emphasis in my campaign has been to focus attention on a development in American life that I think is now crying out for solution. And that is, over the last several years, a rising percentage of women who used to stay in the home are now working. And the life that they face is one that is often very discriminatory. Often they are paid unequally for the same work that they perform compared to a man. Matter of fact, often dramatically so. They are often discriminated against, period, because we haven't ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. There is a growing, tragic phenomenon known as the feminization of poverty, where women working on marginal incomes find that they're actually being punished for work and for not going on welfare.
I'm sorry,
and their children as well. I want to be the president who breaks the ice on that issue and finally achieves justice for the women of this country.
Thank you. Now, again, my question was to use the rebuttal time if you want to talk about differences you see among you as to where the party will go. Mr. Jackson, then I'll get to you, Mr. Hart.
In me, the matter is an issue of priorities and where our real strength lies. I've stayed in the homes of the poor, in the projects, in the ghettos, in the el barrios, because if democracy does not work for the people at the bottom, it fails a litmus test. There it really must work. Last night I lived in the home of Mick and Mary Wagos here in Homestead, Pennsylvania. These are people who simply lost their jobs. They want to work. Plants closed on them without notice. Their ideas as to how to save it, their ideas were not solicited. The jobs were taken to slave labor markets abroad. Somehow we must solve their problem. That's really where the crisis lies. I am convinced that if our party, as a matter of emphasis, is willing to cut back on waste, fraud, abuse, cost overruns in our military budget and move toward a peace economy as opposed to a war economy, we can rebuild these 50,000 bridges, create a new demand for steel, create a new demand for housing, for health care, and for jobs. That becomes the central issue. Put America back to work.
Thank you
as an
very much.
alternative to welfare or despair.
Mr. Hart.
Mr. Drew, two comments by way not of rebuttal but observation about the future of the party. I think we are at a crossroads, as I said, and I think that happens both domestically and internationally, here at home and abroad. Our party is struggling over where we go from here. And there are two schools of thought. One of those is that the way to put Pennsylvania steelworkers back to work is item by item or case by case bailouts or handouts or Band-Aids. Others of us believe very strongly, particularly those of us who come into office more recently, that we need industry-wide policies. I think that is a major difference in our party. A second area is are the lessons of Vietnam. We haven't touched on foreign policy, but I think there's also a struggle in our party over what those lessons were and how to save young American lives from unnecessary involvement abroad and still meet all of our commitments to our allies.
All right, fine, thank you. We will get to the subjects of jobs and foreign policy a little bit later, but next I have a question again for all three of you. It reflects a concern that came in a number of questions sent in by citizens of Pennsylvania, but obviously it's about something that bothers or worries citizens across the country, and that is taxes. All of you have talked about the fact that you will raise taxes on the rich and on corporations and close loopholes. But everybody who really understands the nature of the budget deficit, the real size of it, the difficulty in closing it, recognizes that you can't really come to grips with the deficit without taxing the middle class. Are all of you tonight standing here and saying to the American people, knowing what you know, knowing how uncertain economic assumptions on which candidates base their budgets can be, that under no circumstances would you tax the middle class? We begin now with Mr. Jackson.
I think the middle class did not create the whole problem, and therefore therein does not lie the whole solution. When Mr. Reagan came into office, it was a $30 billion deficit. Now it's $200 billion and growing. A $750 billion tax break to corporations where they did not pay their share. We now have 90,000 corporations that made profit that did not pay any taxes. They must pay their share. That's a way. They must pay their share. On the other hand, a $1.9 trillion military budget is capital intensive, which means we've had a kind of double hemorrhaging of the economy, money going out of both ends and not coming back. Reagan has been guilty of a kind of reverse Robin Hood process, taken from the poor and given to the rich. That process must change. Beyond that, all of us, according to our own income and wealth development, ought to be willing to sacrifice and pay our share of taxes, but under some sense of democracy. My greatest complaint right now about the Reagan tax structure is not that people pay taxes. We ought to pay taxes if we make money and get the benefits from this country, but there ought to be a sense of democracy in the payment of those taxes, and to whom more is given, starting at corporate America, more must be required.
Mr. Hart, I'd like to remind you again, the premise of the question is I know you want to raise taxes on the wealthy and on corporations, nor are we talking about Mr. Reagan's tax program. I want to know whether you feel under no circumstances would you raise taxes on the middle class.
Ms. Drew, I fought very hard against the 1981 Reagan tax cuts, the so-called Kemp-Roth tax cuts, on two grounds. One, that they didn't require the corporations whose taxes were cut to reinvest in workers here in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. And two, they were tilted towards the upper income people in this country and not fairly distributed. That was very strong opposition, but also very difficult because a lot of people wanted those tax cuts. I was one of 11 senators to vote against it and a handful of Democrats. All the pressure was the other way. I believe there does have to be a readjustment of this tax program to help balance the budget. But the key is fairness. The tax proposals I put forward would defer indexing for at least 3 to 4 or 5 years. That amounts to an increase of about $600 a year for middle and upper middle, particularly upper middle income Americans. Now, Vice President Mondale has criticized me for that, but in his own tax policies, in terms of adjusting that deficit and solving that deficit, he himself defers indexing, and that amounts to the same amount of money. The key is, as Reverend Jackson said, fairness. The American people are turning their backs on a fundamental premise of citizenship, and that's paying their taxes, because this is not a fair system and because they are not willing to bear the burden in the middle and lower income groups when those at the top and the large corporations get away. I know we don't want to talk about that, but that is a fundamental problem in this nation.
Mr. Mondale.
One thing has to be done for sure, and that is that these deficits have to be reduced dramatically. If you intend to do that, as I do, you have to both cut spending and raise taxes. And anybody who says they can do it with mirrors is misleading the American people, and the American people know better, and Mr. Reagan, if he's elected, will have to raise taxes. The question is whether it's going to be fair. I have a specific proposal, and I must say that I get a little bit irritated by this question of whether a Democrat has to prove his commitment to responsible government by standing up and socking the middle and moderate income Americans who got no relief the first time around, while the wealthy got enormous relief. I have a specific proposal that I think is fair, and fair to middle and moderate income Americans. I cap the 83 tax cut at $60,000 a year. I have a 10% surtax on people making over $100,000 a year. I defer but reform indexing so people about $30,000 a year or under are not affected. I put a 15% minimum tax on corporations. I reduce the various preferences, that many of which are absurd, driven into the last law, and I have an all-out effort to collect taxes from the underground economy. This is fair, and it saves that middle and moderate income family that didn't get any help and asked the wealthy to join us.
Your time is up, and rather than have rebuttals on this round, I'd like to go on to the next round, which will call for plenty of rebuttals, and I want to have time for that, because I'm going to, at this time, ask you each a separate question, but ask you in your rebuttals to deal with the answers that the other two gave, the questions that I asked them. This time we begin with Mr. Hart. And again, of course, this question reflects a number of questions that came in from Pennsylvania. When you talk about revitalizing industry, beyond the fact that, as you say, you want to get industry, labor, and government around the table, and you want to retrain workers, and you say that it should be industry-wide, the question I have, and I think a lot of people have, is which industries or companies would you revitalize? Any of them that are in trouble, or how would you decide?
No, I don't think the President of the United States, and I'm talking about presidentially negotiated agreements among those parties, can go into every industry in America. There are what I think the experts and economists call keystone industries. Steel is certainly at the top of that list. Autos, machine tools, perhaps farm implements, or one or two other basic industries that not only employ a lot of people and dominate the economies of states like Pennsylvania and whole regions, but also have tremendous spillover effects into supplier industries as well. So when you put steel back on its feet, you're putting back hundreds, if not thousands, of other businesses at the same time. I'm talking about the President getting the management of the American steel industry in the Oval Office, the United Steelworkers, and private capital, and literally negotiating a compact or agreement that has duties and obligations and rewards for every party. Management would get the capital to modernize its plants and equipment and train its workers, but only under the condition that every dollar of that private loan went into those purposes, not mergers, not conglomerations, not acquisitions, where tens of billions of productive dollars have gone. Second, workers would be guaranteed jobs in modern and efficient steel mills in exchange for deferring wage demands or conditioning them on profitability or productivity of that industry, and private loans would be induced to go into those industries by presidential leadership and guidance and federal loan guarantees if necessary. But that would be across the industry, not a company at a time, not a bailout here or a handout there, but the entire American steel industry.
Fine, thank you. While we're on that subject, just a quick follow-up, Mr. Hart. Are there certain industries or companies you would allow to let go, though? How would you make these decisions?
I don't think this country can be a leading economy in the world or an industrial power without a steel industry, without an auto industry, without a machine tools industry, and perhaps all political leaders and economists and others could agree on 2 or 3 other industries. We cannot. We cannot let our smokestack industries go offshore. Those are central to this nation's national security. So the President must tell the American people, steel is key, autos are key, machine tools are key, if for no other reason, to re-employ unemployed people and to defend this country. I think that's a very easy decision to make, but you can't, as I said, go into every industry in this country and do the same thing.
Mr. Mondale, your question is next. I have a different question for you. Then you can respond to Mr. Hart when we have our general rebuttals. This has to do with, again, questions that came in on the minds of many citizens here as well as across the country: Social Security, Medicare, what are called entitlements. As you undoubtedly know, the highest proportion of the budget goes for those kinds of programs: entitlement programs, Medicare, Social Security, federal retirement programs. About 35% of it. 30% goes for the military. Both you and Mr. Hart would, while reducing Reagan's budget for military, you would still increase the growth of it. As you know, 8% goes for the poor, 15% for everything else, which is the Washington Monument, national parks, roads, everything, and the last 13% for interest on the debt. Again, everybody that I've been able to talk to who really examines the budget deficit carefully says that there is no way they can be got under control. And I know you talk about reducing hospital costs. They say even beyond that, we are going to have to come to grips and do something about these entitlement programs. Do you really think you can get the deficit under control without touching those programs otherwise?
First of all, the heat is usually put on the Social Security program. The fact of it is that that program is now sound. Given a responsible economy, they may actually generate a surplus in the next decade. These senior citizens are entitled to our support. That is just not another program, it's one of the most basic programs, and they're not getting rich off it. Most senior citizens are living on the most marginal of income, and I am totally committed to the protection of Social Security under its present system, and I believe the system is sound, and I will not use the Social Security Trust Fund to balance the budget somewhere else. The problem is in Medicare. Healthcare costs are soaring double, triple inflation. I think last year it went up nearly 18%. What's happening is this program and other programs are being ripped off. And that's why I proposed a very strong, widespread, national health care cost containment program, which will save about $15 billion a year within the first few years. That will head off the most serious problem in the entitlements program. Let me say a word about public employees. The last few years, public employees have been made the scapegoat in this country. The fact of it is they're entitled to pensions and retirement too. My program, which reduces spending by $70 billion, does not try to break our word to seniors or to those who need health care or to our retirees, and I think it is just and responsible.
A follow-up to you. You know, Dr. Alice Rivlin, a woman I'm sure you respect, the former head of the Congressional Budget Office, says that there is no way the deficits can be got hold of unless, among other things, there's a surtax and there is a freeze on cost of living increases under these entitlement programs. Do you think she's wrong?
What I don't understand is the Social Security Trust Fund Commission that reported last year is estimating a surplus in the Social Security Trust Fund in the 90s. Every person I've talked to believes that. I do not believe, in other words, I know what those seniors are going through. They're living on nickels and dimes. They are anxious about whether this bargain we made with them will be kept. And there's a lot of things we can't afford, but I, for one, am not going to pick on those old folks. They're entitled to secure retirement.
Mr. Jackson, for you it's a question on schools, which you've been interested in, and again, a lot of citizens of Pennsylvania are very concerned about. This has to do with teaching. In the past year, about a half a dozen major reports on education have come out, and they all agree on one thing, that we've got to improve the quality of teaching, of the teachers already working in the schools. My question is, what would you do to improve the performance of teachers in the schools, either through tests, incentives to better performance, or some other method?
It's not just a quality of teaching, it's also a quality of parenting. If teachers give the homework, parents must have their children home to do the work. If teachers have the best of intentions and children watch, if teachers have the best of intentions and give homework and children watch the national average of 5 hours of TV a night and therefore choose entertainment over education, then the best of teaching cannot save them. We need an increase in opportunity. Teachers who have more discipline and who are more determined, but that I have not found to be the real crisis. We need more adequate funding so that we can appeal to the most aggressive and perhaps our best minds to keep teaching. But that is really a crisis in effort, and to me that's a real critical factor in this whole arrangement. We must increase the quality of teaching and parenting. And lastly, this is the first generation that by age 15 has watched 17,000 hours of TV and more radio than that, which means that mass media quantitatively has more access to our children's minds than home, church, and school combined, and qualitatively it penetrates deeper. To that extent, if media has 15,000 hours, and school 11,000 hours, and church 3,000 hours, there must be an appreciation that education involves parents, mass media, teachers, and church. Education is a community affair, not just a teaching affair.
I've promised you all a chance to rebut, therefore I will deliver, although time is amazingly growing short. So you have 1 minute. Mr. Hart, you want to address yourself to the schools and the entitlements question?
To the question to Mr. Mondale, if I may. First of all, the problem with economists in this country and a lot of politicians is they think that this country has reached a period of a permanent economic stagnation, that we are in a box now that we can't get out of, and now we've got to start looking for villains. And that's one of the criticisms I have of the political establishment. Because once you start assuming the pie is not going to grow, then you have to start taking it out on this group or that group. What if this economy started growing again? It would generate revenue sufficient to pay for Medicare and Medicaid. I have been in the Senate 10 years and a candidate for 1 year, and I have literally talked to thousands of senior citizens who are not taking advantage of Medicare because they think it's welfare. And you start putting means tests on there or cutting back on benefits, and that'll be one of the cruelest things this country can do to people who are entitled to the basic health benefits that a decent civilized nation can offer. And finally, let me just say that I think those programs have to be made the basis for preventive medicine and health maintenance. That'll save more money than anything else.
Fine, thank you. Mr. Mondale, do you want to reply to my question on teachers or to the question to Mr. Hart on jobs? How you would decide on which industries to sell?
The question on jobs. There's no question, in my opinion, that this nation cannot tolerate the disappearance of fundamental basic industries like steel. The question is, how do we restructure them in a way that they can be competitive and be healthy again? The most key issue is, of course, bringing those deficits down, because the deficit doubles real interest rates, and that is just like a dagger in the heart of basic industry, and it's one of the reasons that Pennsylvania suffers 11% unemployment, because, like so many other Midwestern states, including my own, it is basic industry. Secondly, we need a realistic trade policy. This just academic talk, while other nations undermine our legitimate posture in international trade, must change and be headed by a president who knows the difference. Finally, I don't know what Gary Hart thinks about Chrysler, whether that's one of those ad hoc things, but I helped save 600,000 jobs and restored an auto industry to prosperity, and I am very proud of that.
Thank you very much. Oh, that's right, Mr. Jackson.
It is significant that we must take the gloves off on the issue of a crisis in industrial integrity, corporate rape, and corporate ripoff. If the Russians were to send sulfur up and make acid of our rain, were to pollute our air, contaminate our streams, and destroy fish and wildlife, we call it chemical warfare. We'd be very upset. American corporations do the same. Death by any other name is death just the same. We need an environmental protection agency that protects the environment and not just the agents. There must be industrial integrity. On the other hand, corporations under the Reaganomic arrangement have been able to take our tax dollars, our consumer dollars, and the best years of our labor, take those profits and acquire other companies to get richer still, replace people with robots, or take our jobs to slave labor markets abroad. You simply cannot afford that kind of an economic hemorrhage, in fact, and let the economy grow. If there's corporate integrity and accountability, our economy can grow again.
Fine. Now, there's one question that's a quick question, and I'm going to ask for 1 minute responses, and there will not be rebuttals, but it's something a lot of us are very curious about. Everyone knows that one of the major problems in this country today is making the government work effectively. If you're elected president, what are you going to try to do to make our system of government work better? Beginning with Mr. Mondale. 1 minute.
I know what I'm doing. I've been there. I'm going to pick smart, tough people throughout government that are responsible to me. I'm going to run that government as President of the United States. If people don't follow my orders, I'm going to use an old-fashioned Minnesota technique and fire them. I'm going to be in charge. The second thing I'm going to do is to make certain that that government is honest. Every day now, another rotten apple falls out of the tree in Washington, and the president is looking somewhere else. You cannot have public trust or effective government unless the people who occupy it sustain the highest standards of ethics and accountability. Last night, I listened to the president describe his standard. Apparently is You can stay in government, you can be the Attorney General, provided you haven't been indicted and convicted of something. That's not the standard, not getting caught. It is an affirmative standard that elevates the public ethics and the respect and the trust of the American people. A president must do that.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson.
The president is not the personnel officer for the government. Except for a relatively small group of people, he cannot hire and fire as if it were a mom and pop store. A president must offer vision to a government and give direction. You have personnel directors, and you don't see GS 6s and 7s that often. What we must offer at the domestic level is a vision of putting America back to work. You cannot keep raising the military budget, increasing the deficit, keep interest rates high, and put America back to work. That's the vision, and the president must energize the Congress and others, including corporate America, to do that. On the other hand, on the foreign level, we can reduce the danger in this world by aggressive diplomacy as opposed to gunboat diplomacy, big stick diplomacy, and nuclear threat. If we have a peace policy and aggressive presidential leadership, we will inspire a government out of its lethargy, and people will work if they're inspired. What leadership mostly has to offer is a vision. If people have hope, they will help themselves.
Thank you. Mr. Hart?
Mr. Drew, I couldn't agree with Vice President Mondale more on the question of ethics in government and holding public servants to the highest standard, and I was one of the earliest to document the wave of marginally ethical behavior by this administration. The question, however, has to do with efficiency, and I think one of the reasons why our party lost in 1980 election was because there was a sense that the previous Democratic administration was not as efficient as it ought to be. We had a chance, and I think we must, under the next Democratic administration, start with the Defense Department, prosecute contractors that overrun their contracts, and a Justice Department that brings wasteful, fraudulent contractors in the Defense Department to the bar of justice is going to be a Justice Department and a Defense Department that saves this country hundreds of millions of dollars. And so I think one of the reasons why I've campaigned so hard against the special interests in the political action committees is that kind of government, of trying to give something to everyone, has led to that kind of inefficiency that I think the people are fed up with.
Thank you. Now we're going to try something a little bit different in the format. Each of the candidates is going to ask each other a question. In this round, they will ask each other questions on domestic policy. There has been a drawing, so it's all very happenstance as to who got what or who's getting whom. Anyway, we will begin with Mr. Mondale asking Mr. Jackson a question.
Reverend Jackson, as you know, Pennsylvania now has 11% unemployment. This is the worst trade year in American history. It is estimated now that we may well import $120 billion more than we export. 3 years ago, we had a commercial trade surplus. Somewhere between 3 and 4 million jobs have or will be lost as a result. America's market shares are shrinking tragically. The future of our economy is heavily tied up with competitive dominance in international affairs. Things are getting worse. That's why I've called for a strong trade policy. What do you think we should do?
Now, after that term paper question, I'm going to try to give a postcard answer. Number one is the issue of fair trade versus free trade. I believe in free trade, but also the issue of fair trade. When other governments will subsidize their industries to protect their workers' jobs, and our government becomes insensitive to saving vital industries, we are in a very difficult competitive posture. As a matter of fact, we cannot compete. That's why, at some level, building Chrysler out made good judgment as a temporary gesture, because our government has some obligation to save workers, to keep them as tax producers as opposed to tax consumers. So one part of protecting that, of moving from that deficit, is our government must be sensitive enough to keep us in a competitive posture. So we have fair trade as well as free trade. On the other hand, so long as we have these high interest rates, we're going to have the dollar so high until you will not have investment here. You're going to have high interest rates as long as you have the large deficit. You're going to have the large deficit as long as you keep raising the military budget. And to that extent, we have some obligation to really look at the ability to cut cost overruns in the military budget. Look at that $150 billion a year we're paying to defend Japan and Europe 40 years later. I submit we can cut that budget without cutting our defense. That will reduce deficit. That will reduce interest. That will give us a greater ability to compete in the world. And at that level, we're moving in a futuristic way because we're not hiding behind content legislation. We're going forward with aggressive competition.
Thank you. The next question is by Mr. Jackson to Mr. Hart.
I've planned this all week. The real difficult question is, would you enjoy beating Mr. Mondale? Tough question. No, Gary,
I'm going to enjoy beating Mr. Reagan even more.
Gary, on a more serious note, the crisis, as I see it here, workers, 140,000 unemployed in the Allegheny area here, and plants are closing on workers without notice. Workers never have a chance. They even have a tax incentive, some of these plants, to close, and they'll leave the American worker high and dry. What would you do in terms of a tax approach that would take away the incentive to close plants on workers in this economy and transport those jobs abroad, or to acquire and merge and leave the workers strung out?
It's a very important question, not only for this state, but I think throughout the industrial area of this country. Two things have to be done. Tax incentives to export jobs have to be canceled, whether foreign tax credits or the aspects of the so-called DISC program that actually reward American companies for taking their manufacturing and their jobs abroad. Second, we have to have tax laws that only provide tax reductions for corporations that invest their untaxed profits in the modernization of their own plants and the training of their own workers. We cannot have these across-the-board corporate tax cuts which lead to tens of billions of dollars going into unproductive mergers and conglomerations and abandoning hundreds of thousands of workers. I think there has to be a national plant closure law in this country that, at the very least, provides notice to communities, provides notice to workers, authorizes workers, if necessary, or to come up with alternative financial arrangements or try to devise some means of keeping that plant open through new financing, and at the very least gives the community and the workers in that plant a chance to transition to something else. That's one of the reasons why I've put forward the idea of an individual training account, so that when workers are dislocated, they have some financial means to fall back on, and they do not end up out on the street and leaving their families and their homes right out in the cold. We are one of the least humane societies in the world in terms of how we treat our workers, and that has to be reversed, and it will not be reversed under Ronald Reagan.
Sorry, we have to move on so that everybody gets their chance. Maybe you can bring it into your closing statement. Anyway, the next is a question by Mr. Hart to Mr. Mondale.
Fritz, under the previous Democratic administration, unemployment went up in this state. The steel industry declined. Dozens, if not hundreds, of plants were closed. There was relief in isolated incidents of one or two plants. But overall, I think in this state, more than 50,000 workers in that industry lost their jobs. What do you think, in very specific terms, what new proposals do you think we ought to adopt to put the entire industry back on its feet and put a state like this back on its feet?
First of all, we were working very hard on the problems of the steel industry through the years of our administration, and probably did more to try to help that industry than any administration in American history. We put the trigger price mechanism in place. For the first time, we set up the tripartite commissions, labor, management, and government. We were going to do for steel what we did for Chrysler, and we were making progress. We were also beginning to take a tougher stand on trade because the industry has been characterized by being a victim of a broad range of foreign predatory practices that have really been very, very unfair. And finally, we were helping industries to get back on their feet. For example, Wheeling Pittsburgh Steel is an example of the future. That was a company that was losing its competitive edge. It had some severe environmental problems that it wasn't able to solve, and I helped work out an arrangement where they got back on their feet. They're now producing the most advanced, highly competitive steel rails. They're in very good shape now, and over 1,000 jobs were saved. That's something I stood up for, and what we need to do is to go back to that approach, help the steel industry modernize, get competitive, work together. The key word is cooperation. When labor and management and government works together, as we did in Chrysler, the potential is unlimited.
Thank you. Now, we're moving on to the foreign policy section. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to limit your answers to this first question to just about a minute so that you will get your chance to ask each other questions again. And this question also will not call for rebuttals. But it has to do with an area of foreign policy that you haven't talked about but raises a lot of questions. All three of you have talked about the importance in our dealings with other countries of taking the long view of what our nation's interests really are. A good example now of the kinds of policy questions this raises is the Philippines. We have bases there for which we pay a large sum of money. The Marcos regime, which our government has backed for a long time, is in serious political trouble. If you were president right now, what would your policy toward the Philippines be? I'll begin with Mr. Jackson.
My policy would never be to negotiate away human rights as a measurement for our relationship. We need bases in the Philippines, but we need our self-respect in the Philippines. That government, if it remains in the state of tyranny as it is now, does not deserve our support. We have no right to determine the quality and the kind of that government by propping up a dictator and propping up tyranny. We can protect our interests there without involving ourselves in the internal affairs of that government. I would reduce aid and use aid as a leverage to help humanize that society. Because if we do not do that, there will be a long-range rebellion and revolution. And if we do not make the adjustment now, we'll be on the wrong side of that revolution. When the people rebel, seeking to be measured by one set of human rights rules, it is inevitable. We should not make the mistake in the Philippines that we have made in Nicaragua. It is inevitable that there will be a change there. We should be on the right side of history.
A quick follow-up, Mr. Jackson. If you had to choose between keeping the bases and being friendly with the regime, which would you choose?
At this point, if I had the choice, I would never negotiate away human rights, even for the base. I do not think our options are that limited. We have enough leverage to do a both-and we ought never negotiate away that ability. They need the bases to protect themselves as well as we need the bases to protect ourselves. But we, more than anything else in the world today, we need our self-respect. And we cannot keep our self-respect embracing dictators.
Mr. Hart.
Same question?
Same question.
Same answer.
Well, same answer. Well, it is unfortunate that this country has gotten itself in the fix it is, not only there, but South Africa and a lot of other places, particularly under this administration, but also even before 1980. Reverend Jackson's exactly right. Mr. Marcos needs us as badly as we need him. In fact, I think politically and economically, he needs us more. He is not going to kick us out of that country or close those bases down. His economy would collapse, and he would have to flee to some foreign capital that's more hospitable to him. This country has no choice in the 1980s and 90s but to recognize something that John Kennedy recognized 20 years ago, and that is 2/3 to 3/4 of the people on Earth live in the emerging nations of the Third World. For 20 years, this country has abandoned its commitment to democratize those areas and offer human assistance. We're paying the price. We paid it in Lebanon. We paid it in Vietnam. We're paying it in Central America, and we're going to continue to pay it so long as we prop up governments that do not share our fundamental beliefs and values. We have a role in the world. It just doesn't happen always to be a military role.
Thank you. Mr. Mondale.
I've had some experience in the Philippines. I visited the Philippines as vice president, I think it was in 1978, and precisely the question that you've raised was on the table. Mr. Kissinger in the previous administration had kept the heat off of Marcos's human rights violations, including martial law. And in fact, Marcos held him up for ever-rising costs of Subic Bay and Clark Airfield bases, and they were unable to get an agreement. We went over there and we changed the tune. And we said, Mr. Marcos, and I did this in public and I did it in private. Those were tough talks that went over, I think, 2 full days. I said, we cannot tolerate the abuse of human rights in this country and remain silent. Our nation stands for human rights and we want progress. I pleaded for Mr. Aquino's release. And at the same time, I did something that Mr. Kissinger couldn't do. We got negotiations started again that resulted in a long-term contract for those key bases. Human rights and national security do not collide. They're usually mutually self-enforcing.
Thank you. Now we go to the section where, again, where the candidates ask each other questions, and continuing from the drawing of lots at this point, and the subject will be foreign policy, Mr. Hart will put a question to Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Jackson, a related subject to foreign policy is, of course, defense. You have taken a different position from that of Vice President Mondale and myself. You want deep cuts in the military. My position is, if we do that, 2 things will happen. We will lose the skilled personnel that additional benefits are needed to retain. The country will be weaker as a result of that. Many people, including many minority people who see the military service as a way out, would abandon that. I think the country would then be forced to go back to a draft. What are your views on that, and would you still support the cuts under those conditions?
I accept the first premise that you and Mr. Mondale are alike on that question. Let's get that point clear. All right? On a very serious note, we can cut this budget without cutting our defense and running us into a crisis. That is to say, 90% of all of the defense contracts are no bid. It leaves way for a lot of corruption and waste and abuse. We need to challenge that arrangement and break up that degree of socialism within that billion-dollar racket. Number 2, 40 years later, we're paying $150 billion a year to defend Japan and Europe. It's about half of our military budget. Now, Japan is bragging about it will only pay 1%. Europe about 3.3%. We're paying about 6+ to 7%. We should have a serious commitment to troop reduction in Europe. Begin to cut back on those costs. Japan and Europe are on their feet now. They can either accept that peace thrust or they can use some of their own money to help defend themselves. We cannot very well run a wartime budget for Japan and Europe during peacetime. If it were wartime, we'd have to close down America just to defend Japan and Europe. So we can cut that because they're better able to share that burden. Lastly, if we cut the MX and the B-1, we simply have enough money to cut the defense budget without cutting our defense. I do not think we'd therefore run into an emergency. If, however, we were in an emergency, I would use a draft, but if it were an emergency, most Americans are so patriotic they would need to be drafted. History has shown that they will volunteer if it's an emergency. Going to Lebanon, going to Honduras, that's not an emergency. That's a tragedy of leadership.
Thank you very much. I must ask you also to keep your questions brief if you do want to get your closing statements in. The next is
I'm first, though.
A question from Mr. Jackson to Mr. Mondale.
South Africa represents a great source of shame in the world today. It operates as if it were a democracy, but of course blacks have to have passbooks. It's racial oppression. They have nuclear capability. Westinghouse from this town is aiding them with their nuclear capability, which threatens the entire human race. And then beyond that, South Africa, of course, becomes a great recipient of jobs because it's a slave labor market. What would you do to break off or change that relationship with South Africa and therefore make it compatible with America's highest and best values?
This gets back to the earlier question about human rights. The practice of apartheid in South Africa is exactly the way you describe it. It is vicious, it is profound, it is an insult to human rights and to our values. We've tried for years to get them to change. I think we now have to start turning that screw tighter and tighter. I have made several suggestions of what I would do. Number one, I would expand the restraint on which now embargoes arms to cover all police equipment. Secondly, I would support, I think it is the Bill Gray amendment, which would prohibit any new investments by American businesses in South Africa. Third, I would support the IMF provision, which would prohibit any international loans to South Africa. Next, I would prohibit the sale of Krugerrands into the United States. I would finally, if that didn't make any progress, prohibit the flights of South African airlines into the United States and begin to work multilaterally to make it known that our country cannot stand by and permit this profound abuse of human dignity to continue.
Now, Mr. Mondale, you ask a question to Mr. Hart.
The issue hasn't come up yet, but I believe that the control of nuclear weapons is the issue. Because if those god-awful things go off, nothing else will matter. That's why I support the freeze and the other things. What's your view?
Well, Fritz, you know from the period of the 1970s when we worked very closely together on the SALT II Treaty and other arms control initiatives that I share that fundamental belief with you, and in fact it's one of the reasons I'm in politics today and running for the presidency. I have teenage children, as I know you do, Reverend Jackson does. I think it unites us, doesn't divide us. I think the question is how to get that freeze and what to do in addition to the freeze as quickly as possible. My view is that the freeze is a major contribution to the arms control debate. I think we have to go beyond it, not after it, and do a number of things all at the same time. Ban weapons in space, freeze the production of plutonium, stop proliferation of nuclear technology and materials to third world nations to stop the horizontal arms race, set up a system whereby neither we nor the Soviets in a period of crisis start World War III. And I know that you agree with that. We will not do that, however, unless we defeat Ronald Reagan. I hate to keep bringing it back to that, but what frightens me the most about Ronald Reagan is not only dividing this society along economic lines, but the unrestrained 4 more years of a nuclear arms race that I believe would bring this world, and I know you do too, right to the very brink of nuclear war, and perhaps over that brink in a period of crisis or misunderstanding. This, President, frightens me to death.
Thank you. Now we'll have the closing statements, and so that you all do get to complete them, I'm afraid we have to shave them a bit more briefly. There'll be 1:15 so that everybody gets their chance. We begin with Mr. Mondale.
Last evening, along with most Americans, I watched the President's news conference. And I thought I saw something happening that we've seen happen too often before. That President is getting detached from what's really happening in our country. He said his tax and his budget policies were fair when we know better. He said his policies were controlling arms, and we know better. I've been in that White House, and you need somebody as president who keeps a sense of reality and stays close to the American people. A president, if he's not careful, can start inhaling the royal treatment that he receives. The stewards, the White House, the trumpets, Camp David, it's very intoxicating. And with a little bit of trouble, a president can very quickly think that the state of the nation can be judged by the condition of the rose garden. Look for somebody who knows the difference, who knows what it's like to be unemployed, to be unfairly taxed, to see your children not get a decent education, to watch your jobs go overseas, to retire and worry about that Social Security, to be discriminated against because you're of race or for other reasons. Get a president who remembers that it was the people who put him there.
Thank you, Mr. Mondale. Mr. Jackson.
As I've participated in this debate tonight, April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated. Tonight, we sit here, April the 5th, 16 years later. In so many ways, what was a crucifixion 16 years ago, a period of mourning and riots, explosion, and tragedy, It's tonight a moment of resurrection, of new life and new possibilities. In some sense, I must express my gratitude to our nation, for I represent the element that once had the challenge to pick cotton, and now we can pick presidents and make a directional difference. It is significant that tonight the issue is not a new generation, it's a new direction. A new direction. To share that ticket with a woman is the right direction. To cut the military budget and move toward a peace policy is the right direction. To train our youth to end the slums and rebuild America is the right direction. A high production economy to rebuild 50,000 bridges in this country and build hospitals and houses. The move toward an economy away from workfare and welfare, but one of self-respect, is the right direction. When I had the challenge a few months ago to go to Syria to try to get Lieutenant Goodman, it reinforced in my mind that our strength as a nation is in developed minds, not in guided missiles. I didn't believe that Goodman should come home. I went and got him. Diplomacy does work. Let's choose peace.
Mr. Hart.
I grew up in a working-class household where neither of my parents were able to finish high school. I helped earn my way through school working on the railroads of Kansas and Colorado. And like many of my generation, I was attracted to public service and commitment to this country by a president 25 years ago named John Kennedy. That president challenged our generation, as I would like to challenge this generation, to commit to this nation a new path and a new vision under new leadership that understands the changing times in which we live. This country cannot rebuild its steel mills and rebuild this economy of this great state of Pennsylvania. Put ourselves on the path to true equality, social justice, and opportunity for our citizens. Unless and until we have a president who understands these changing times, who represents that new leadership, who stands upon the basic convictions and values of the Democratic Party, and who offers to this country new hope and promise because of those ideals and because of those solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That concludes tonight's debate. The next league debate will be in Dallas. Thank you, gentlemen, for participating and cooperating. Good night.